My watch says we've got 30 seconds, so I'm going to use that to just start the introduction. My name is Dan Kubisky. I'm the co-chair of the International Community for the Society of Professional Journalists, and I know for most of you it's got to be surprising that the SPJ has an international side. I would encourage you to go take a look at us on the SPJ site. We do regular YouTube interviews with journalists and experts around the world. We've been doing this for about 4 years now, I think. You see some pretty interesting things there, and you see that there's really great connections. Today, we're going to talk about threats to journalists or threats to society. Threats to journalists are not just threats over there. We know they're happening in the United States. But panelist Vicente Calderon, who's the founder and editor of Tijuana Press, he's been warning his American colleagues for some time that the threat that he has seen in Mexico is coming here to the United States. And we saw it in 2018 when the Annapolis Capital Gazette was attacked and 5 people were killed. Last year, Jeff German, who was killed because he was doing his job. Glenn Cook, executive editor of the Review Journal, the newspaper where Jeff was at, has been leading his team under these dire conditions. Vicente has also pointed out from his experience that the attacks on journalists and press freedom signal a decline in problems for society. And we're going to talk a bit about that today as well. Actually, I'm not going to be talking much more in a little while because Jessica Jerreat, who is the editor of the Press Freedom page for Voice of America, will be moderating. And I should point out that as important as press freedom is to all of us, I only know of 2 organizations in the world that have a dedicated press freedom beat: Voice of America and Al Jazeera. So think about that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica to begin the discussion.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you all so much for joining us today. Obviously press freedom is my beat, but this is so important, particularly as we come into election years. The Nobel Laureate award-winning journalist Maria Ressa, she was speaking at the National Press Club earlier this month, and she said, "We will know by the end of 2024 if democracy lives or dies." We have key elections coming up next year, including in the US. We're seeing a 17-year decline in civil liberties globally, record number of journalists who have been jailed, and a rise in disinformation. And at this time, the role of journalists has never been more vital or more under attack. So in our panel today, we really want to look at both the attacks and how they affect journalists, but more importantly, how they affect our audiences and our ability to keep acting as public watchdog. On that note, I wanted to start with Glenn. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about Jeff Germain's work. He was this renowned investigative journalist who tragically lost his life just for doing what journalists are meant to be doing, looking into official corruption, wrongdoing. Could you tell us a little bit about his work and that public watchdog role and how that plays an important part for a healthy democracy?
So Jeff German was a reporter here in Las Vegas for more than 40 years. And he earned a reputation for not just being a trusted reporter, but a very aggressive reporter, and a reporter who was really guided by an innate sense of right and wrong, and holding people accountable, whether they were criminals who were working their way through the justice system, or whether they were public officials or elected officials who needed to be held to account for not doing their jobs. And over Jeff's career, some of the most noteworthy work he did in his career was covering the organized crime era here in Las Vegas. And he covered a lot of bad and dangerous people, and was never afraid of them. He was a fearless reporter. And you know, the worst thing he endured in all those years was a sucker punch in the lip from a mob associate, and when he was younger. But Jeff was murdered just about 13 months ago to the day in September of 2022, Labor Day weekend 2022. And the man who was arrested and charged with his murder and is scheduled to go to trial in November here in Las Vegas is a man named Robert Tellis, who was a low-level elected official here in Southern Nevada. He was the elected public administrator. He was, which is an office that if you ask people in Las Vegas what does the public administrator's office do, they might not know. It's an office that administers the estates of people who have died and don't have a will, and an executor can't be located. So there's an enormous amount of trust that goes into doing that job. Far from Jeff doing his most incredible, impactful investigative work on Robert Tellis, the story that he published about Tellis in May 2022 was nonetheless important accountability journalism, because Robert Tellis was up for re-election, and the employees of that office came to Jeff to tell him how poorly run the office was, how toxic it was, and how he wasn't doing a good job in this role. And so Jeff did a story in which he laid bare the fact that Robert Tellis was a bad person, a bad husband, a bad boss, a bad public official. And he lost re-election as a result of that story. And so, again, despite the fact that this was a low-level office, this goes to the role that journalists have in this country and why our rights are enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution. The founders of this country knew that they needed a strong, free press to watchdog government at all levels, not just Congress and the White House, but all the way down to the public administrator in Clark County, Nevada. And Jeff did that. Jeff did that throughout his career. And based on the evidence that police and prosecutors have collected, it is clear that Robert Tellis was furious with Jeff and the Review-Journal, far from taking accountability for his own behavior and his own choices. He blamed Jeff for ruining his career and ruining his marriage. And so when Jeff made another round of public records requests related to Mr. Tellis's conduct, I believe it was the morning that Tellis was notified that the county was about to release a new batch of records to Jeff for further reporting on him. It was later that day that Jeff was murdered. That's my recollection of the timeline. So it was a shocking killing. This just does not happen, thankfully, very often in the United States. And as far as the Review-Journal has been able to determine, we have not yet found another example of a sitting elected official being charged with the murder of a reporter over press coverage. We haven't found anything like that in modern American history.
Thanks. I mean, as you say, it is very rare for that level of threat to happen, but we do see an increasing rise of threats even in the US. For people who are interested in this, I can recommend the US Press Freedom Tracker, which from 2017 records any violations against the press in the US, from chilling statements to threats to sort of physical assaults and searches and seizures. I wonder, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, have you seen what happened to Jeff having any kind of impact on the newsroom or among your competitors in terms of people being anxious or second-guessing whether they should follow a story?
Actually, what I've seen in terms of work is the opposite. My newsroom, filled with a lot of courageous and dedicated employees at the Review-Journal, and from the moment they released the image of the suspect in Jeff's murder, they really aggressively pursued trying to identify who the killer was, and we made it one of our highest priorities as a news organization to finish his work, to finish all of the stories that he had already started, to finish the additional stories, the follow-up investigation that Jeff was doing on Tellus. His colleagues Art Kane and Brianna Erickson did pretty much all of the heavy lifting on that. And then most notably, a big story that Jeff was working on that we knew we were simply not going to have the reporting firepower to finish. We got an offer of assistance from the Washington Post, and they sent Lizzie Johnson, one of their best reporters, to Las Vegas to finish a story on a Ponzi scheme that targeted people of the Mormon faith in Las Vegas and the resulting criminal charges associated with that case. So I'm encouraged by the way that the industry really threw its arms around the Review Journal in terms of supporting us in our newsroom and recognizing what a dangerous moment this represented for us as an industry, and the way that journalists have responded in the importance of making sure that if journalists are targeted with intimidation or threats of violence or violence itself, that the work gets done. And so a Review Journal staff writer, Brianna Erickson, when she went to Orlando this year to the IRE conference to accept the Don Bowles Medal for Jeff posthumously, Brianna put it best. She said, you can kill a journalist, but you can't kill the story.
Thanks so much. As you said, Tellus goes on trial in November, but Vicente, you work in Mexico, where one of the deadliest countries for journalists outside of a war zone, and in many cases, no one is ever brought to justice for those cases. How does impunity or the lack of justice in a journalist case affect the sort of environment? Does it embolden more people to think that they can get away with silencing a journalist?
Thank you. Thank you to anybody for showing their interest in this, and thank you to them to put together this panel, and thank you for being able to share this topic. I think it's really important, and have to express my condolences to you and to your colleagues, because it really gives me the chills when I listen to you remembering Jeff, and it's something that we need to make conscious about it and make an effort to overcome, and to just keep remembering him and his legacy and what he unfortunately went through in favor of freedom of the press and expressions for the society. Trying to answer a little bit, and I apologize for my poor English, because it's lazy, and I haven't been able to make it better. But I hope I can be able to express myself. Impunity is a big issue in public safety issues in Mexico, in general for the whole society, and particularly in journalism. When the attack against journalism, we have more or less the same, probably a little bit less level of impunity than against general population crimes. That's a big issue in Mexico. And one of the things that we have been able to be pushing, but not able to succeed completely, is to make it into the law to investigate first there's a protocol when a police reporter gets killed in Mexico, that the main thing that the police has to do is to investigate as the motives as part of his reporting job. Unfortunately, as many other laws in Mexico are on the books, but are not really enforced. So this is just making it worse for us. I'll give you the example of our colleagues who were killed last year. There's a the master, what we believe, and everybody more or less agreed that is the mastermind of the killing of Margarito Martinez, the photographer, who works for the very famous in Mexico, Latin America, weekly publication Setup. He's on jail, but after more than a year, almost 2 years, he's not been charged with that particular crime. He's on jail because of the pressure that my colleagues and other media outlets and US media outlets have put on the matter. And the guy is on trial for a different homicide. There's 3 guys who were sentenced. 2 sentenced and 1 who is still on trial on the case of Margarito. Those are the material killers. Those are the ones who were given the orders to commit the murder. But the mastermind is still not facing charges for that. There's 3 guys who are already sentenced by the killing in less than a week later on Lourdes Maldonado. But again, the mastermind is not even identified. So impunity just gives them free range to anybody who feels the possibility or thinks about the possibility of killing a journalist. This has given the chills to many of us, and there's a lot of censorship. You guys are dealing with news deserts here in the US. We have news narco blackouts because there's communities, there's cities where the reporters are not even able to publish press releases because the drug organizations, the organized crime groups, can be calling the reporter just to tell them to erase that story or to print that story. So, and the authorities are not doing their job. The main problem for us is that the government is not complying with its obligation to punish the criminals behind the crimes against journalists.
It's a really shocking comparison between the news deserts there, which brings me to my next point. First of all, I just wanted to say we want this to be interactive. I forgot to say at the beginning. If anyone has any questions or wants to comment on what's being said, just raise your hand and we can just loop you into the conversation. Vicente, you work on the border, you work in Mexico, you work in the US, and for years you've been pointing out that this decline in Mexico, you're starting to see in the US. What are the warning signs that you're seeing, and how does that sort of impact, from your experience with Mexico's journalists, how does that start to affect the ability to still be able to report on corruption and crime?
In the Mexican case, well, the first problem is that we don't have strong institutions. And even when it's on our constitution, the freedom of the press and the freedom of expression is not enforced. You in the States have a lot more stronger institutions, although, as we've been seeing in the last years, those are being eroded too. And that's a big red alert. So what we have seen is that we need to rethinking, because in the case of Mexico, we have a long history of government-run media. But still, we used to have a general image of the reporters for the people. People kind of think that we were like the last resource to denounce a problem. So we were closer to the community, although they see us in many cases too close to the government, but they understood that we were controlled by the government. With that said, I need to say that there's always been good, independent, very brave reporters in Mexico. It's not the majority, like probably in many cases, but there's always been great reporters. And in the case of the US now, you have to work a little bit more, I guess. You have to work a little bit more to show the people, the general public, what's the value of the role of the reporter. We are thinking about maybe cases of behind-the-scenes stories to show how the reporters are trying to go beyond their own personal basis and really try to do their own work. Because we need to, in this, we are as we as Mexicans are as polarized as you guys are right now. We now, either you love Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador or you hate it. I don't have to give you the example here because you guys, everybody, you all identify it. And we need to make a bigger effort because only the public can help us to reduce their dangers for the reporters and then increase the demand of the government, because we have to do the same for them. I mean, I don't think the reporters are in more danger than the general public in Mexico, but sometimes specific stories get us closer to danger in Mexico right now. So it's a learning process. I wouldn't dare to give you or give my colleagues advice, but I will invite them to try to explore or situations to try to learn from it more than trying to teach each other how to deal with this issue, which is honestly we really don't know.
It's really interesting, the comparison with polarization. Glenn, I wonder how you've seen that, or like any sort of distrust or concern within the communities that you guys report on, and if you, in the wake of what's happened to Jeff, if you've changed like your safety risk assessments for reporters, where you know an offhand comment from a aggrieved reader suddenly carries a greater weight to it.
Yeah, so we have modified our safety protocols as a direct result of Jeff's murder. And for anyone who's been in the business for a reasonable amount of time, dealing with upset people who could even be verbally abusive is just sort of part of the job. Journalists, a lot of the work that we do is dealing with people in their worst moments, whether it's someone who's in the criminal justice system, a politician who's been accused of doing something unethical or illegal. We ask tough questions of people in difficult circumstances. Additionally, we have always kind of drawn the attention of people who are, let's just use the word unstable. I mean, at all points of my career, there have always been people who have bothered me, bothered other reporters, bothered other editors, with some fantastical story. They mail you, a manila envelope with 500 pages of documents that make no sense and tell you that this is the story of the century. You're dealing, always going to be dealing with people who are a bit unstable. And but the default setting for journalists, I think, has always been, because if you've stayed in the business, you have developed a thick skin. You can't last years or decades in this profession if you don't develop a thick skin. And as a result of that thick skin, your inclination when you're dealing with someone who may make you feel uncomfortable is to blow it off and not tell anybody. It's part of the job. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I have to deal with that. Even if somebody makes you feel uncomfortable. Well, Jeff had never communicated to any of his editors at the Review Journal that he felt uncomfortable or unsafe as a result of some nasty social media posts that Robert Tellis made about him. And to be fair, none of the posts that Mr. Tellis had crossed a line into a clear physical threat. The only threat that was contained in one of those posts appeared to be a threat to sue the newspaper, which also not something that's terribly unusual. And we have our own separate set of protocols to deal with, right? And in fact, when asked about them, Jeff told someone, Jeff's attitude was, I've dealt with worse. That was his response. I've dealt with worse. And he had. He covered organized crime. But what we've communicated to our news organization, and what I urge newsroom leaders, ground level reporters, entry level interns, everybody I talk to about this is to make sure that every employee in your organization organization understands to never make a threat assessment alone. It is, if you are dealing with somebody, and even if they just make you feel uncomfortable with something that you said, if you in your gut feel like something's off with this person, makes the hair on your arms stand up, let alone becomes angry with you, report it up the chain. You know, if you're a freelance journalist, tell somebody. If you work within a larger news organization, report it up the chain to your editors, and make sure that people know that you have just dealt with someone and you didn't feel good about that interaction. Make it known. And additionally, you know, as an organization, we have taken the position that if we think anybody has crossed a line, we are going to call the police. You know, we are absolutely going to call the police. And since Jeff's murder, we have filed 3 police reports against people who said things to us that we believed crossed the line. One of them was a local judicial candidate in last year's elections who was quite upset that we were, as part of covering this judicial race, was upset that we were bringing up a misdemeanor incident from a couple of decades earlier. And essentially, what he told the reporter was, in relaying his frustration that she was doing this reporting on this part of the story, he essentially said something to the effect of, hey, you know, you have to be fair when you report this. I mean, look what happened to Jeff German, right? And that was essentially, that was the gist of his quote. And so he got a knock on the door and a badge in his face, and apologized profusely, and we wrote a news story about it, and he lost. So it really is, I just urge everybody, you know, if someone makes you feel uncomfortable in doing the course of your job, or if they treat you, you know, if they're hostile to you even, you know, just tell somebody. Tell somebody.
I think it's really important just to normalise that in newsrooms. Like, I started out where it was still considered almost like a rite of passage to have the slightly unstable person start calling you and complaining, and it was like a war story to tell. So it's been really interesting over my sort of 20 years in the industry to see how that's changed when we take it more seriously. And I think when you have a newsroom that's backing you and normalising it, so you can, everyone's sort of threat level is different, I think that really helps. I'm just going to take some, sorry, let me take
Well,
a
I
question.
wanted to add to what you said. I'll grab it.
Thank you. I wanted to add to what you said. Thank you for saying that, because, you know, I've worked in many markets like Los Angeles, Dallas, Corpus Christi, San Antonio, you name it. And because I say Rebecca Aguilar, I've had people call me and call me a spick, go back to Mexico, and I've always told my bosses, because I don't know if someone's going to show up on assignment and just shoot me because I say Rebecca Aguilar instead of Rebecca Aguilar. And I've always told, especially TV reporters, because they can follow us home, that, you know, something like that, I mean, that is being aggressive. And some of these people will take it further than just calling me a spick. They'll, you know, maybe try to hit me or hurt me. So thank you for saying that, because, you know, I think, and all my bosses have taken it seriously. But I do have colleagues who are white, and they have been threatened, and I guess sometimes they look at it differently. Maybe it's because I've grown up with racism and people who are ugly. But I'm glad you said that, because you're right, you need a second opinion, basically. So thank you.
So I have a question, 2 questions. One is that after the assassination was done, what was the mental state of your reporters, and how did you deal with the chilling effect that this crime sort of, the wave that went over your newsroom? And how did you try to give them confidence that that management sort of stood with them? And then for Vicente, I want to know if, with all the killings that have been happening in Mexico, especially in Baja, what kind of a chilling effect does that sort of resonate with the journalists, the Mexican journalists? And does that make them too afraid to really write the truth, and maybe their reports are maybe not as detailed, or they're more vague?
Thank you. Well, the chill effect is there. That's why we have some of those so-called narco blackouts, because in some cases they were forced, but you don't need to be forced. They don't need to threaten. I mean, when they see that they have killed a colleague, they decided they don't want to go to those issues. I mean, I talked last year, some young reporters who were very promising, still very promising, but have decided that even things that are suspicious, they don't want to cover. And I give them the reason, and I think it's fair. Only the reporter knows the risk. I think it's very important what Glenn told us, because especially now that even in the States, we have so many freelancers to do the current conditions of the news market. You have to talk about these issues with somebody. It doesn't mean that you don't have to question yourself the way you conducted as a reporter and how you treat your sources. We still need to do that, but on the other hand, we also need to be able to talk to somebody. We now are more willing to talk about mental health in general and for the reporters. I don't know if this is a little bit of the macho culture in the Mexican side, or maybe it's not that different across the border, but we also want to be independent, a little bit individualist, and we want the school for us. We want to be the first ones. And sometimes we were trained, or we were told that we want to be the only ones exposing things. Sometimes you have to evaluate how risky that can be, because I really believe that things start escalating little by little. And as we were talking before, words can turn to actions. And in this current environment, I think it's worth a little bit more extra work in order to try to diminish those risks. I hope that we are very, very scared to start, and there's some self-censorship in many cases. Sometimes we try to go around and deal with embargo stories and wait till there's better conditions, or find somebody who's willing to back up the statement, or you talk to the authorities and wait so they move. But even sometimes after somebody has been exposed, they are still able to work. The main problem that we had, just going back to the case of the alleged mastermind of our colleague last year, the guy is still killing people from within the jail. Of course, at the beginning, we were about 8, 9 reporters covering the trial. Last time we went, we were just 4. Sometimes it's 2. We need to keep remember these reporters who have made this sacrifice, and it's something that nobody wants to be talking about these stories. Nobody wants to be doing those stories, but we need to remember when this happened.
To answer your question about our newsroom, so Jeff's murdered in broad daylight on the Friday before Labor Day weekend. His body's discovered on Saturday. I'm the first person in the company to be notified on Saturday evening, and we are able to post his obituary and the fact that he's been murdered at just before 1 a.m. on Sunday. And what greatly complicated things for us was, at that time, we were still working 100% remote as a news organization. We were 1 month away from returning to office under a hybrid schedule. It's a holiday weekend. I can't recall how many people were out of town taking long weekend. But many people weren't even in town. And so, because of the way the timeline fell, the vast majority of our staff learned their colleague had been murdered when they woke up on Sunday morning, and the first thing they see on their phone is a mobile alert that their colleagues were murdered. And so the first day and a half, that Sunday and Monday, is me just calling as many people as I can and talking to them and seeing how they're doing. And it's about a day and a half of just a combination of what I would say just shock and fear. Complete disbelief that there's a story on our site that says Jeff Ehrman's been stabbed to death. And fear, because obviously everyone's thinking that there has to be a chance that he was killed for doing his job. Right? And simply trying to tell people to, honor Jeff by sticking to facts. Jeff was not a guy who leaped to conclusions. The police, I thank Las Vegas police that once they identified him, they basically moved his case to the front of the line. They gave it a very urgent designation in terms of the resources that they dedicated to his case. But as far as how we reacted, as soon as we got the first image of the suspect, everyone just got to work. Everyone was like, let's find this person. And we did it. We figured it out just about the same time the police did. And we were staking out Robert Tellis' house with police the night before a search warrant was executed at his home. And for our news organization, that was how they responded by doing what Jeff had done. We talked in the newsroom about how if this had happened to somebody else, Jeff would have been the first one to raise his hand. He would have wanted this story. This is a story that he would have covered every turn of the screw. That was the type of person that he was. That said, the grief was obviously there, and I think people weren't really able to begin processing it properly until after Robert Tellis was arrested. And I think one of the turning points for us was we held our own memorial service for Jeff. Jeff's family had a very small, very private ceremony for him, service for him, which is their right and their choice. And we felt it was very important for us as a newsroom, along with some of his closest friends in the community, to have the opportunity to properly honor him, remember him, and pay tribute to him. And so the message that we conveyed to the newsroom was, once we got it scheduled, we pushed it out. I think it was in mid-October, so it was close to 6 weeks after he was killed. But we told everyone in the news organization that everyone is welcome, and if we have to leave the newsroom empty for 3 hours, we will leave it empty for 3 hours. Whatever happens, we'll catch up. We'll get the job done afterward. But if everybody wants to come, everybody can come. We'll lock the doors and we'll come back. And but there ended up being a handful of people who did not want to attend, who just felt it was going to be a little too hard, and they raised their hand, volunteered to fill key shifts. It wasn't necessarily their jobs. Almost everybody else came, and it was deeply meaningful for everybody to be able to do that together in person after working remote for 2.5 years. And the other thing that I would just add is that if any newsroom goes through trauma, I can't say enough good things about the Dart Center for Trauma in Journalism at Columbia University, because we made grief counseling available to everybody in our company. But in the newsroom in particular, the feedback that I got from every person who met with a grief counselor was, I had spent half the time explaining like what a journalist does. They just didn't understand. They did not understand what the job is, what we see, people we talk to. And the flip side was the sessions that we held with the Dart Center these were led by journalists, and journalists who have been through traumatic situations. And so for our team to walk into these sessions, not necessarily, not talking to a certified grief counselor, but talking to a journalist who has also been through terrible things, was the feedback that I got from everybody was incredible, and we won't hesitate to use them again, as much as I hope we don't need to.
Sure, sorry, let's go to you.
Oh, I was just curious because it's my understanding that Robert Tellis is representing himself and that he has been giving interviews from behind bars. I'm just curious what it's been like for your publication to cover that.
I will say I'm enormously proud of, there's a pretty small group of reporters and photographers who are consistently dealing with Robert Tellis throughout, as both his criminal case has navigated, and then for some of you might have been on the Thursday panel that I led. There's a that I didn't lead, I was part of, that concurrent to the criminal prosecution of Robert Tellis is a separate but very important press freedom issue, which is that police and prosecutors have possession of Jeff's cell phone and personal computers and want to engage in an unrestricted search of his devices, and we are trying to block that. But because Tellis is representing himself, he is in the court for every single one of these hearings. And in most of these, he is sitting about as far away as Dan here is from me, from my employees. And the professionalism with which they have carried themselves in fairly covering his proceedings and writing about it in a way that gives him the presumption of innocence, I'm exceptionally proud of that. It is incredibly difficult for them to do that. And in particular for a couple of our photographers, because he's stopped it since he began representing himself, but there were some moments early in the process where he would look right down the lens of my photographer, and mug, grin, stuff like this, that really pretty disturbing. So we're, and obviously whenever he goes to trial, we're going to be there every day. I just can't say enough about my staff doing that week after week after week.
That level of support is really great to hear, but Vicente, I wonder if you, what about the journalists in Mexico, those who are most at risk often, independent journalists, either they run their own outfit themselves or they're very small teams. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways they've tried to protect and support themselves in these sort of ad hoc like WhatsApp groups and other methods they've been using, particularly last year, which was, I think, one of the deadliest years for Mexico, and I know in Tijuana particularly you lost a couple of your guys out there.
We are still trying to learn and trying to get organized, but I was remember, for example, last month, at the beginning of this month, I was in another journalist convention, Mexican journalist convention, and in some of the rooms, some of the reporters who were sharing their experiences in very hot or conflict, dangerous zones, they were asking not to publicize some of their own comments, even among their peers. There's really, this level of violence has inflicted a level of damage in the journalism corps that it will take a long time to heal. I don't think the society is still losing because there's still ways to publish, and there's very courageous people that is finding ways to still keeping doing their work, their job. The case of Zeta, it's admirable for me. They have 3 colleagues who have been killed and still are printing the best journalistic example against organized crimes in a city which deals with not just 1 but 3 drug cartels operating and fighting each other and killing an average of 5 persons a day. So they are still demanding, for example, to the impunity that they see in a colleague who was killed in 1988. Every week, every issue that they are publishing still have the picture and the demand that the mastermind is brought to justice for the more than 30 years right now. We are learning. First, again, many of the reporters decided not to cover or show up at a crime scene on its own. And they developed, I was asking you, some of you may remember the Nextel, the walkie-talkie kind of phones. On those phones you were able to create groups. So they created groups. When somebody listened to a police mobilization, an operation, a killing, a banner of narco messages, or a cadaver being found or down somewhere, they will notify the rest. So to see how many of them could be willing to arrive at the same time. Some of those guys, I mean, not everybody was willing to go, but at least we knew, and we are kind of resorting to the body system, as they call it in the military thing. If you go to some place where you think there's some level of risk, well, you notify a couple of people. Now you can share your location to your apps with WhatsApp or with other. Now they are using more Signal, for example, to share more encrypted systems. We are still learning, because even when we have done some progress, but still these guys find ways to still go after some journalists. And we are talking about the ones who are being killed. The threats are still happening, not everybody is reporting them. And some of us, we don't report the threats because we don't feel comfortable. We don't know if you express that or publicize the threat, that will make it safer or make it worse. But what I really think is now we are sharing more about the dangers of some of these assignments or possibilities of coverage.
I think we've been talking about how the threats affect the journalism community in our own newsrooms. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how it affects coverage? I mean, if there's stories that we can't cover, if officials feel that they can threaten, attack, coerce journalists to not tell a story, we're coming into big elections, there's distrust in the media, what does that mean for our audiences at the end of the day? Are we losing out on coverage?
The quality is hurting. I mean, it's not the same quality of coverage. You have less people willing. I mean, you know how it's difficult to cover all the matters that are relevant to the community. So, and our sources are every day more limited. Now, with some of the topics not even being willing to consider for some of the reporters, we are missing a lot of the details. And one of the things I learned in these past conventions, I was interviewing one guy from Article 19, this freedom of the press organization that works in Mexico, and he was telling us something that really called my attention. Lately, the attacks against journalists are not only coming from organized crime members or criminals. In many cases, it's a combination between politicians and politicians corrupt that have some links to these organized crime groups. So sometimes this is a very problem, because if the politician seems that he is being targeted by a reporter, some of their quote-unquote associates on the dark side of the law are willing to act even without them giving the order. So the level, in this environment that we are dealing with, that level of impunity in Mexico, the level of danger is just there. That, for that matters, many of the reporters are not willing to risk it. Because also, for example, in my case, I'm not just worried about myself, but I'm also worried about my family. I mean, you have seen that many people is just willing to kill you for a couple of doses of methamphetamine. That's, I mean, you don't need a big hitman that charges you $10,000 to kill you. In this environment, things like that happen. That's why also many of the reporters killed are not really trained, quote unquote, professional reporters, but people who see the need and resort to a Facebook page or their own website or other social media account, and they are doing the role that other reporters are not doing because they don't, either because they are afraid or because the companies don't have the liability, they don't want to have the liability of having to deal with a reporter, one employee that will be facing these risks.
Yeah, I would just add that I, as a newsroom leader, am really concerned about the tone of what the 2024 campaign is going to look like. I fear a campaign in which the media are elevated to essentially a campaign opposition, right? Where instead of a presidential race being between two major candidates, it's going to be one major candidate against the other and the press, and another major candidate against the other and the press, and media coverage being cited as everything from reasons to trailing in the polls to reasons that blatantly favoring another candidate. Anybody who's worked in news media recently knows that has probably been subject to the demonization of that. All news reporters, no matter how you strive for fairness, is in the tank for the left, right? And you're liberal, you're in the tank for the Democrats, this, that, and I expect that to escalate in the year ahead. And you talk about red meat for the base to get them angry at the press. That's a pretty toxic stew, and that creates an even more difficult environment to work in for all members of the press.
I think, yeah.
Oh, somebody else? No, go ahead.
I was going to say, if we open up to questions.
Yeah, I have a question. So I kind of just started to touch on it when politicians start to, criticize the press and stuff like that. How do you deal with that compared to just politicians, like you said, Vincent, just kind of making a nod at someone doing something, whereas a politician clearly calls out the press saying, this is fake, this is wrong, and stuff like that. How would you deal with that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, depending on the answer is it depends, and I think that it's for the American press, I think it's the role of the institutional voice, it's the role of the editorial page and executive leadership to defend a news organization, defend reporters, and to call out wrongful criticism. I think the news reporter's job is to try to sift through that junk and present issues that really matter to readers, right? Because if someone spends a bulk of their speech, for example, and they're talking about the media or this or that, well, I don't think you're helping readers who are voters, make a decision on how they're going to cover the campaign if you pay too much attention to that. I think it's your job to record it, take notes on it, talk to your editors about it, and to collaborate and make a decision on, okay, is this actually the story, or is this simply stuff designed to fire up the base, and what is the real story? So it is, if you're in the television business, it's kind of unavoidable if you're broadcasting live. If you're going to a major presidential party nominee who's making a big public speech at an event in front of 5,000 people, and you made the commitment to live stream it or broadcast it, and they start yapping about how bad the media are, well, there's nothing you can do about that, right? But I think if you're a political reporter, I just think the important thing is to document it and talk about it with your editors to figure out if that's the story or not.
There's one politician in Mexico, every day goes out and rants about us, the Mexican president. So we are learning to deal with that, but one thing I understand is that we need to be able to prove them wrong. Well, first, in my take is like, does he have a point? I mean, we need to be conscious and explore our reasoning and our process. Maybe we're missing something. It's not. I don't think there's nothing wrong with just double check yourself. But if not, the only thing I can think of is like, let's just prove him wrong. Now, if you guys heard the expression of alternative facts, he has one who says, I have another set of data. It's like the counterpart of that, I mean, because you give them their own government statistics, and, oh, I see it differently, I have different. So you have to evaluate, as he says, every case in its own context, I guess.
One question at the back, and then I'll come to you, Dan.
I have a question for both of you, and I'm specifically sorry for both of your losses. How do you protect your identity and your safety as a journalist and dealing with those issues? And like, for example, myself and my reporters at the Fresno State Collegian, we had a bomb right on campus on Thursday, and it was because of like a TikTok account, not a TikTok account, but a far-right account criticized a professor for asking for pronouns. So they bombed right our campus, and we just get a lot of conservatives that get our comments and stuff.
I'm sorry that you have to go through that. Again, you have to talk among your peers and to see people that you are relying, they are willing to be confident and express that, because it's in this day and age, we need to not take it lightly. I mean, even if you laugh about yourself later, it's better, but once you took a hard look on that situation. I don't know exactly. I've been in conflict zone training areas, for example. I remember I was to be looking at the rear view mirror more often, given the space to I don't get too close to the next car. I always want to be able to watch, to see the back tire, so that will give me enough space to run away from things. I try not to be on the phone when I'm driving, because that will make me be more aware of my surroundings. Little things like that. Even one of the first things I learned after the 1988 killing, just don't use the same route all the time. I mean, you don't have to be paranoid. You have to be careful. And sometimes if you feel you're paranoid, just do it and just be conscious and just be self-minded, so to speak. But this is the best thing that you can do. But at least you know your context and what you're feeling. You have to pay attention to your feelings.
We're in, I think, unique position as journalists, because part of our job is demanding transparency and access to public information, and I think that being part of a journalist in the United States is to, you have to understand that how easy it is for anybody to find information on anybody, right? Especially in the age of social media and with all of us, particularly our younger generations, are used to being on mobile devices all the time and sharing lots of details about your life. So my feeling is, and the way I approach, so like my Facebook account, which I'm more of a Facebook consumer than I am a poster, right? And it's not public. No, people can't tag me. They can't come in and see unless they're a friend of mine, right? And I try to not post a lot of personal stuff on social media, but if you Google me, you can find out a lot about me, right? It's just, that's kind of a fact of life of today. For me and my personal safety, I don't use earbuds. I don't use earbuds. When I walk my dog, when I don't have earbuds. I can hear everything that's going on around me, and I'm aware of my surroundings. I try to look around, right? And like what you said, it's not about paranoia. I'm not living my life in a paranoid state, but it's just recognizing that there's little things that I can do to protect my own safety on a daily basis that will just hopefully make it a little bit harder for somebody if they want to do something to me.
Oh, I was just going to, just quickly, I just recommend as well, if you look at the Committee to Protect Journalists, they have a really strong journalist assistance program. I used to work there and was very involved in the emergency stuff. They have a lot of really good resources for what they call like digital hygiene. So there are things you can do to help protect and lock down your accounts, things about sort of physical security, and also a lot about resilience. And when you're dealing with something like that, particularly if it's a bomb threat that you have to report on and then the team need to regroup afterwards and just have a check-in. They're a really great team there. Even maybe reach out to them and see if they can do a session with you at the university. And I'd recommend that for everyone. If you're, they do very specific safety advisories. If there's something happening in the news that you're likely, whether it's covering the protest or the debates, all the little things that you might not think of when you're going to cover one of these events, it's just really good. And especially if you're a student journalist and you're getting into that, like being aware of your risk assessments and working those out with your assigning editor and getting into that routine at an early age, it makes it much easier than when you get a little bit further along in your career and you're trying to sort of do it retrospectively. But they do have a really good resource, particularly on the resiliency side. I'd really recommend looking. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Kate Cagle. I'm a reporter in Los Angeles for Spectrum News 1. It's a cable news channel, and I had a question because last year I covered our sheriff, Alex Villanueva, who very infamously tried to put an LA Times reporter under investigation. But even before that, his attacks on the press had been escalating. And he had even put my face up at a press conference to disparage reporting I did or didn't do. And that was pretty common for him. And my news outlet decided not to engage on that level because they said they didn't want to get to that level of personal attacks where it was like me against him, right? We tried to just really focus on covering the department and the issues. But it just stuck out to me when Glenn said, now you take all those uncomfortable situations very seriously, but when it's coming from, say, the head of law enforcement of a multi-billion-dollar agency, there's no police report about that. Like, he is the police report. So I'm just curious about, and especially hearing from you too, about with the president, like, how do you deal with when it's coming from the top?
Well, what I would say is my earlier remarks were kind of in the context of, the general lob of the bomb at the media, right? But public official is attacking a specific journalist, that is, I haven't heard of anything like that before. And I think that's pretty chilling, and I think, I think that's a story. I think that's a story. If a sitting public official did something like that with one of my reporters, we would, in consultation with the reporter, obviously, but my gut is we would do a story. We would do a story on that. But yeah, it is. I think it lends to the importance of press freedom and free institutions and like Committee to Protect Journalists and Journalists Without Borders and all of these organizations to shine a light on behavior like that, and I applaud other news organizations that when they see stuff like this happening, that they elevate it, right? I think one of the best recent examples is what happened in Marion County, Kansas. That was as soon as I saw the first story on that happening, I was on the phone trying to get my Associated Press rep on the phone to say, tell me you're writing about this, right? And fortunately they recognized that for being a national story. But I put that story on the top of our front page. That's a big deal because and we have a local government here in Southern Nevada that is particularly opaque. The city of Henderson, and they take a lot of steps to try to make our job harder, but we also, after what happened in Kansas, you just can't be sure what any government institution, how far they're going to be willing to go to try to suppress press coverage. And the terrible, terrible thing about what happened in Marion County, Kansas, was the elderly woman, the owner, who clearly suffered such personal stress from having police raid her house that she died. I mean, that was just an abomination. And so, we had, I know we're running over time, but I'll just give you another relevant local example here in Southern Nevada, which was in the aftermath of the terrible mass shooting that we had here on the Strip. We asked for the autopsy reports on all the victims, and we got them. And then the survivor of one of the victims went to a judge and demanded that essentially that the autopsy records that were handed out be pulled back and that news organizations couldn't report on them. And so the separate judge basically issued an order that said that not only ordered us, the Review-Journal, to not publish anything from the autopsy reports, but ordered that we bring back, that we turn in all of our paper and electronic copies of these public records, which obviously we weren't going to do, but we had to prepare our newsroom for a potential search by police. And so we had to huddle with counsel, and we had to brief the entire operation on, here's what's going to happen if police serve a warrant, here's what you have to do, here's what you don't have to do. And I never thought in my career I'd ever have to deal with something like that. But that's the kind of, you see these things happening more and more, and it's born from an ignorance of press freedoms and a hostility to the press within our very governments, and I just think we have to call it out aggressively every chance we get.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, I've had to, Voice of America, I had to report on a very difficult political retaliation case for over a year, and it's hard to report on yourself, but it's so important. I think as well, what we found coming out of our experience, but it's actually helped foster trust with our audiences, that we were pushing back and saying, our journalist integrity is being threatened here, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to report on it as if we would any other story. If you haven't already reached out to them, I'd recommend the US Press Freedom Tracker, just because we are trying to document it within the press freedom community. There is a rise in chilling statements, in searches and seizures. It's like 90 searches and seizures of journalist records in the last 5 years. And the more data they have, the more that newsrooms can start to adapt and think about what happens. I know we're over time, but Dan, since it's your session, you have a question.
Yeah, Vicente knows this question. Jessica, you know this question. It's a tradition in international community events that the last question, because we are over time, but the last question is a very simple one, but it's one that we think about all the time. What does press freedom mean to you?
Press freedom to me means the ability to do my job without interference from all levels of government.
It's a constant goal that has been earned in the Mexican side with a lot of blood and tears, but something that is the pillar of the rest of the other human rights in general.
To protect and uphold the right everyone has to credible and accurate information.
Thank you.
I think that's it. Unless there's any other questions, I really thank you all so much for being here. Glenn, thank you for being
Thank
so
you very much.